Hello my friends and welcome to 7 true scary stories from YouTube users. Whether online or in person, we're more than eager to share the strange encounters that have happened to us throughout our lives. And regardless of its reality, we're still so intrigued by the possibility of its actuality. Here's 7 true scary encounters from YouTube users. I have a story for you. It's rather strange, and it happened when I was living with my parents. Now, I'm not sure if this was a dream or if it actually happened. It felt really strange. I've never believed in the supernatural, and I still kind of don't. But anyway, back in my teen days, my parents were always out a lot due to finally having free time to themselves, so I would stay home with my little brother alone. It didn't bother me because we live in the middle of a deep and dense forest, which made me feel safe knowing that no one would come around and rob the place. Anyway, this night, my little brother went to sleep at a friend's house while my parents had to go for the night. It was 12 a.m. when I went to bed after watching a movie alone. I was totally fine staying by myself, but tonight I felt uneasy for some odd reason. I decided to sleep in my parents' room because it gave me the secureness and safety I felt I needed. I left the door open for extra precaution, and then I fell asleep. I woke up to my dog barking like crazy. In my head, I thought my parents had come home. I look at the clock, seeing that it's 3 a.m. in the morning. I slowly walked into the living room, seeing my dogs near the window, still barking, so I decided to look outside. I saw nothing, but by the looks of it, the rain had come by and ended. Suddenly, I hear a quiet knock at my front door. I freeze with fear, wondering what I'm going to do. I don't know why, but I opened the living room window, and I asked who was out there. I heard a low, graspy voice. It almost sounded like the person hadn't had anything to drink for weeks. The man then asked if my father was home. Again, I don't know why, but I decided to walk down the steps to the door to hear him better. I opened the door slightly, seeing an elderly man. He smelled of wet dirt, and he looked like he may have tripped and fell in the mud due to the fact that his clothing was dirty. I then politely said, "I'm sorry, but my dad isn't here." He then looked passive and answered back, "Oh, I see." He paused for a moment and said, "Can you tell him John came by to see him?" I wanted to tell him something. I replied with a nod and wished him farewell as I watched him walk back into the darkness. I closed the door, feeling confused in a way. My dad had a visitor this late at night, and why did he walk here? Hearing his last name, I knew he was a relative because we shared the same last names. My dogs are still barking like crazy. I called them into the room to sleep with me the rest of the night, and it was peaceful. The next day, my parents came home. I almost forgot to tell my dad of the strange visitor until it started raining again, and I smelt the wet ground once more. I walked over to my dad and I told him the story from last night. He paused in silence and stared strangely at me. Then he started to get mad and walked out of the room, which confused me. I told my mom, and she asked me where I heard the name from. She didn't believe me when I told her my story. And then she said, "John is my father's close uncle who had passed away before I was born." A buddy of mine, I'll call him Ace, once told me this story, and it still gives me the shivers thinking about it. It was a year or so back. He and his girlfriend had just started getting serious, so he goes over to her place for the first time to spend the weekend with her. He sees her python for the first time, and she mentions how he hasn't eaten anything in the past few days, despite her giving him more food. And she was going to take him to the vet the next day to see what could be wrong. She also mentioned that she let him out at night and asked if that would bother him. Ace is a pretty hard guy to scare, so he said he didn't mind. Heck, he goes skydiving and spent the last summer trying to find a place he could go swimming with sharks. Anyway, they go to sleep that night, but Ace can't get to sleep. He just feels something watching him. He sits up, seeing his girlfriend's python on the floor at the edge of the bed, looking dead set at both of them. He wakes up his girlfriend and tells her about it. She says the python usually sleeps in bed when he's out and jokes about him just being jealous of Ace. But Ace asks if he can put the python away for the night. His girlfriend is confused and annoyed, but she must have seen how afraid he was because she agreed. Like I said, Ace isn't an easy guy to scare, but the fear I saw on his face when he told me the story was the most scared I had ever seen anyone before, and I can only imagine it was worse when it was actually going on. So they put it away, and it takes a while, but Ace finally gets to sleep. The next day, they take it to the vet, who says there's nothing physically wrong with it. Ace brings up what happened the night before, and the girlfriend told the vet about letting the snake out. The vet turns to the girlfriend and tells her the reason the snake hadn't been eating lately. He was keeping his stomach empty because he was preparing himself to eat her. Over 5 years ago, when I was 16, my grandfather passed away. Much like us, he lived pretty far out in the country, surrounded by farm fields. After he passed, we struggled to clean up his estate. It was just me, my dad, and my brother, hauling away an endless amount of farm equipment, construction supplies, and furniture. I was balancing school, work, sports, and the big cleanup over the course of 4 months. I was a shell of my former self, not just because I missed my grandfather, but because I rarely slept longer than 4 hours a night. About 2 months into the cleanup, our family had a big fight, and I opted to stay at my grandfather's house for the weekend. Our dog, Milo, wanted to stay with me because he loved all the free space there was to play. Milo is a golden retriever and chow mix and is very well behaved, so I had no problem looking after him. That Friday night, I was looking forward to getting my first full night's sleep in months. As the night went on, I was relaxing and watching TV when Milo came over to get my attention. He was asking to go out, so I got up and I went to the door. I stepped out ahead of him into the open-air sunroom and took a deep breath of what I thought would be fresh air. However, it didn't smell like the fresh spring air that I normally smelled. Instead, my nose filled up with the smell of decomposing flesh. It was about 11 p.m., and the moon was full, but I couldn't see anything. Milo was about to walk past me when he froze in place, right by my left side. He sniffed the air. Then when his head went right down, he looked at me with very scared eyes. I began walking outside to investigate while Milo stayed frozen behind me. Suddenly, a loud howl began emanating in the field that was to the left side of the house. I froze when I realized that, even though I couldn't see it, there was a wolf less than 100 feet from where I was standing. I began backing up slowly, and as I did so, another howl started, followed by another, and another. I turned and ran as I escorted Milo back to the house. There was at least 40 howling wolves all screeching at once when I shut the door. I made sure all the doors were closed before I put some newspaper down for Milo. Afterwards, I called my dad and I let him know what was going on. He didn't need to tell me, but he told me not to let the dog out and to stay inside for the night. The entire night, all I could hear was footsteps and growls outside. I barely slept again. When the morning came, I left Milo inside and went out to the field with some firecrackers and a big axe. The wolves were gone. It didn't take me long to find some rib bones of a deer right next to the center of the field. I actually found one of the bones right behind the house, about 10 feet from where I slept. To this day, I'm grateful that I didn't let Milo out on his own. I always supervise my animals no matter what. This happened to my grandfather about 50 years ago. He went to this little town in the middle of a mountain in Mexico to work, and to help his older brother, who was working as a teacher there. That place got extremely dark at night, and you could barely see the road you were driving on in town at night. He worked at a little grocery store until 8 o'clock at night, so when he got out of work, it was already quite dark. This happened one particular, darker and colder night than usual. He was driving on the main road. His car was the only one in the road at the moment. Then he started smelling this burning metal smell. And suddenly all the lights turned off. Everything went dark. Even the stars. But he knew he hadn't died because he was still driving. And then a voice came from the passenger seat and asked, "Do you have a cigarette?" My grandfather looked at the man and said he was dripping this weird metal substance and had these huge horns on his head. Suddenly the lights came back on and the man was gone. My grandfather didn't stop driving. He was too scared to think anything. He got to his house and simply went to sleep. Until this day, he still had no clue who or what that was or what he even wanted, and he really doesn't want to find out. He's believed in ghosts and the afterlife ever since. Fun fact, my grandmother and grandfather met in the same town, and they even married there. The story isn't really all that scary, but it did scare me when it happened. It was the first day of winter break when I was 14. I was home alone. My mother and sister had left about 2 hours before, and I was just laying in bed watching YouTube videos. Then all of a sudden, I started to hear noises outside. My bedroom and the back door are just a wall apart. At first I just kind of ignored it because we're close to some woods and we have little visitors all the time, so of course I just ignored the sounds and went back to watching YouTube. A couple minutes, I start to hear the back doorknob start to jiggle and I hear men's voices. As a young teenage girl, I start to freak out, and I snuck into the kitchen and got the sharpest knife I could find. I remember the only thought I had was, if these guys were going to try to break in, they would have a fight to get through. The noises started to get louder outside, and the knob would occasionally jiggle, and if you got kind of close, you could hear the two men talking to each other. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I called the police. But of course when they got there, the two men have left, and they can't find any evidence of anyone who was there, except me. So they leave, and about 10 minutes later my mom shows up, panicking, just being a mom. She called the landlord to see if he had sent someone to work on the house or anything like that. The landlord says that he did, but it was for the house next door, and that they weren't supposed to be there till 11 a.m. This happened around 8 a.m. So my mom just said that it was the workers that the landlord had hired, even though they weren't supposed to be there at my house, let alone messing with the back door. Needless to say, I don't hide away in my room anymore when I'm alone. I make my presence known. It was summer and I had recently turned 15. My dad wasn't doing too well financially, so he moved up to the mountains to stay with his friend Damien, who was the owner of a restaurant called the Snow Crest Lodge. Damien put my dad to work with a lot of physical labor, moving rocks, decorations, and cleaning. In return, Damien gave him food and a place to live. So one weekend, when I usually paid a visit to my dad, my sister Jenna, my cousin Crystal, and my uncle went up into the Snow Crest and went on sort of a mountain adventure type thing. It was pretty fun for the most part, but the coolest part was when the sun began to set. It was getting darker by the moment, and our hike back down the Snow Crest was nearly at an end. The sun was set as we approached the Snow Crest, and the song Hotel California by the Eagles was playing loudly from the lodge. It was about 8 p.m., and no one else was around. Business was slow, and not much was happening, so Damien closed the shop, and we hung out at the lodge for the night. We played pool, listened to music, and had a really good time. Then the ghost stories began. Damien said recently 2 of his employees quit after something happened to them in the downstairs area of the lodge. He said that his employees were obviously in a relationship, and after work they went downstairs and started kissing when they noticed that they weren't alone. They ran upstairs and told Damien about the man downstairs, and they went to investigate. Now, there's truly only one way in and one way out of the downstairs area, and that's important for later. But when they went down there, nobody was there. The 2 quit on the spot and never came back, so I'm told. After being told that story, my dad came up with a challenge for my sister, cousin, and I. He said, "I dare you guys to stay down in the basement for 10 minutes in the dark." We weren't convinced until he sweetened the dare with $5 for each of us. He agreed, and we made our way downstairs. Below the restaurant is a place where people go to celebrate. There's a bar, a dance floor, a stage, and a little gazebo-type area to hang out. It wasn't what I expected at all, but it still gave me a weird vibe. My dad showed us around and then said, "Okay, have fun," and laughed a little spooky to mess with us. He walked down the stairs, turned off the light, and went back upstairs. As soon as the lights turned off, the room suddenly felt full, as if we weren't the only three down there. I know this was probably some paranoia because of the stories we were told, but for some reason I kept feeling that I shouldn't be down there. Those feelings soon came to fruition. About 2 minutes in, not much was happening, until my cousin scared us by turning on the stage lights. She said, "He never said we couldn't turn the stage lights on." That was technically true, so we gathered onto the stage and the light, and that's when things started to take a turn for the weird. The dance floor I mentioned earlier was directly in front of the stage that we were on, and it was only us three down there. Suddenly we heard a tapping from the floor. It started from the opposite end of the floor, slow and quiet. We looked at each other, kind of awestruck, but then the tapping got faster and closer and faster and closer until it was on the foot of the stage. And just as it started, it stopped. We huddled together after that, and a minute went by, and suddenly, slams from behind the bar, and you could hear knocking on the walls. We thought for sure that there was something with us at that point, because there's no way a sound that loud could be produced without anyone being there. We all jumped and my cousin screamed, but it wasn't over yet. My sister and cousin decided it would be smart to look at the walls and try to ignore the sounds. But I was just so concerned that someone could be down there, I kept searching the darkness of the rest of the room, and that's when I saw it. The moment I saw it, I got chills instantly down my spine, and I still get chills just thinking about it. A shadowy figure of what looked like a skinny man on all fours, staring at the wall. And for some reason, the second I noticed it, it seemed to notice me. It turned its head slowly and looked at me. White, deadlocked, empty, socket eyes. And it stared. It didn't move. It didn't talk. Just stared. I felt a malicious feeling and my heart sunk. Thought it was a real person in there with me and my family. I can't do anything about it. I'm only a 15-year-old boy. What can I do? I spoke out loudly to my sister. "Turn on the lights." She said, "No, I'm not turning them on." I told my cousin, "Turn on the lights." She said, "You're just trying to scare us." I yelled, "No, I see something and I want the lights out now." The amount of panic in my voice was convincing them enough for them to look at me, but not enough for them to actually help me. I felt the tears welling up my eyes, and I was beginning to panic when I impulsively started running towards the exit. The only problem was the thing I saw was still there. This was no apparition that suddenly appeared. It was still there, and I knew I had to get out. The adrenaline made everything seem so slow as I ran past the thing on the floor. I ran up the stairs in the darkness and luckily didn't fall, and as I got to the top, to my horror, the door was locked. My dad had locked it to make sure we spent the whole 10 minutes down there. I banged on the door, practically crying at this point. When my dad opened the door, I flew out of there, out of the lodge, out onto the road. I stared at the building, catching my breath. My dad came out with my sister and cousin behind him, asking what had happened. I told him what happened, and I told him I would never go down there again without him. After calming me down, I went back into the lodge, but I couldn't go back downstairs. I'm not sure if you've ever had a gut instinct telling you, you're in danger, you're not safe here, but it's one of the worst feelings I've ever had. That's the end of the story, but I did end up going down there again and snapped some pictures of the area with my dad and sister and cousin. There's supposed to be an event there the next day, so the tables and chairs were set up. But at the time of the story, it was an empty room. We caught a few orbs in the photos, and it's easy to be skeptical about orbs, except the strange thing is that they all appeared in areas where the weird thing I saw was. I have pictures if you want to see them, not top quality or anything. I hope you like the story, and I have some more that I'm willing to share. After the event, it piqued my interest, and I've actually been into ghost chasing. I've caught some crazy EVPs and such, but yeah. Thanks for reading my story. You're the best. A few years ago, my family went on a tour of an orphanage where the headmistress had horribly abused children. Now the place was supposedly haunted by their spirits. All the guests were seated on benches set up in the basement, where the children had allegedly been locked in, listening to the tour guide. Suddenly, from a row behind me, my sister cried, "Something touched me!" And then she said that her bracelet was broken. The tour guide said that people often had jewelry break off them down in the basement. Afterwards, my sister showed me the bracelet. The connecting clip was intact, but the bracelet was indeed broken in half. Do you have a scary story you wish to share? You can write them in the comments below, or email them to me at xemoristar@gmail.com. That's all the time I have for today, my friends. I hope you're having a wonderful day or evening. I'm Emori. Now, listen to the spooky tunes. My mom and my sister had left about 2 hours before, and I was just lying in bed watching some YouTube videos. Probably my show, right? Totally.